reviving the music of 19th century free people of color in bringing Morgiane to its 138-year delayed world premiere. We started out with a 550-page handwritten manuscript and have created from scratch all of the musical parts, including a vocal score, an orchestral score, orchestral parts, and piano reduction of the orchestral material for rehearsals. It is the first edition of this magnificent piece of music, and our performances in New Orleans, Washington, D.C., New York City, and at the University of Maryland will be the world premiere of the earliest existing opera by a Black American. Tonight, my guests are going to discuss Morgiane, its background, and significance at a pivotal moment in American and musical history. Our first guest tonight is the foremost advocate of the music of Edmond Dédé, and I am honored to be her partner in bringing Morgiane to life. Givonna Joseph is founder and artistic director of the award-winning OperaCréole. Her research on 19th century New Orleans free classical and operatic composers of color and Creole history and heritage was recently featured on NBC Nightly News, NPR, and in magazines such as Black Enterprise, 64 Parishes, and Atlas Obscura. Since 2011, the international soloist, arts integration specialist, and university lecturer, along with her daughter, Aria Mason, OperaCréole's co-founder, has received several honors for mounting lost or rarely heard operas by composers of color. In 2022, she received the Torchbearers Award from the New Orleans regional chapter of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women. Ms. Joseph is the former education director for the Louisiana Philharmonic Orchestra and was most recently featured in educational documentaries including Songs of Slavery and Emancipation, Dillard University's Ray Charles Center for Material Culture's Legacy of American Slavery, and the New Foundation's Voices of Renewal, celebrating the Creole language. Ms. Joseph teaches the class Opera, Classical Music, and Race at Loyola University, her alma mater, and gives back to several organizations such as the Council of French Societies, the Symphony Chorus, the Black Administrators of Opera, and Opera America. Givonna, my dear friend, welcome to Opera Lafayette's Salon series.
Thank you so very much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Always to be with you, Patrick.
It's great. It's great to see you, Givonna. Also joining us tonight is Dr. Naomi André. Dr. André is the David G. Fry Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Dr. André's research focuses on opera and issues surrounding gender, voice, and race. Her publications include topics on Italian opera, Schoenberg, women composers, and teaching opera in prisons. Her books, including Voicing Gender and Blackness in Opera, focus on opera from 19th century to the mid-20th centuries and explore constructions of gender, race, and identity. Her groundbreaking monograph, Black Opera, History, Power, and Engagement, illustrates race and history in opera today in the United States and South Africa. In 2019, Dr. André was named the inaugural scholar in residence at the Seattle Opera and has also worked with every major opera company in the United States. She has written program essays for recordings of the contemporary operas Blue and Fire Shut Up in My Bones. On February 4th, 2022, she testified before the Committee on the Judiciary as a witness for House Resolution 301, examining the history and importance of Lift Every Voice and Sing to become a national hymn, sponsored by Congressman James Clyburn of South Carolina. Naomi, welcome to the Salon series.
Thank you so much. What a real honor. And I'm so happy to be working with Opera Lafayette and OperaCréole. Incredible work you're doing.
Well, we're really, really excited to have you on the Salon series. For our audience, if we have time at the end of this program, we'll be taking questions from you. I'll remind you of this later, but feel free to put any questions you might have into the chat and I can pass it along to our experts. But without further ado, let's talk a little bit about Morgiane, especially let's start out, Givonna, with some talk about Edmond Dédé, our composer. So would you, you and I are both from New Orleans, and we grew up in New Orleans, and yet I think that both of us found out about Edmond Dédé much later in life. So, can you tell us who Edmond Dédé was an artist, and how does a free person of color born in New Orleans at the beginning of the 19th century end up making a life as a conductor and composer in Bordeaux, France?
Well, I think Edmond Dédé is the hero of New Orleans that we should uplift at every opportunity. He was born free in 1827, but he was a fourth generation free person of color. His family came to New Orleans from Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti. And at that time in our history, if you came into the state as a free person, you remained a free person. And so he was born free. And he came into a wonderful tradition of New Orleans of classical and operatic music. New Orleans is documented as the first city to have a full opera season in 1796, sorry. And so he was enveloped in this beautiful tradition that he made his way in learning from his father, and found being a free person of color was not as elaborate as it sounds like. It was kind of a narrow existence. There were many things you could do, but lots of things you could not do. But he found his way through that to develop himself as an artist, to compose, to publish as early as 1852, and to make his way to France, to fully actualize who he was born to be. And I'm very proud to be able to uplift him in this way. He wrote many, many wonderful pieces of music. And the first, Mon Pauvre Coeur was one of the first I received of him, and sang of his. And I was joking earlier that I think it's the first blues song. It might be an art song, but I think it's the first blues song because of the lyrics. But there's so much that we can talk about in terms of Edmond.
And so Edmond Dédé, but he's also trained at the Paris Conservatoire. I mean, he flees the Civil War, ends up at the Paris Conservatoire, and then is hired in Bordeaux as primarily, I think, right, a conductor, right? I mean, he
conducted La Sonnambula. That was one of his first jobs. And what's amazing about him is when he learned that he could possibly go to Paris to the conservatory, he left New Orleans and went to Mexico to work in a cigar factory so that he could raise money to go on the trip. And he left at a time prior to the Civil War. There was this time where all of a sudden people said, oh, there are just too many free people of color. There's too much, it's too easy to become free. They're becoming too popular and too powerful, and we need to shut this down. And so if you were freed after a certain period of time, they made you leave the state. If you left the state for any reason, you were not allowed back in. So he had to lie on his documents to get back home from Mexico long enough to make his way to France. And so it's a scary period of time, but he made a way out of no way, is what I always say about him. Yeah.
There is so much I have loved learning about Edmond Dédé because he has not been a central figure in American history and music history. And I'm so glad that this is changing with your performance and this production and all this work. I think a lot of us in the United States, and I'm from New York, lived in Michigan, now live in North Carolina, visited New Orleans, but haven't really been there that much. But in terms of music or history, we don't realize that there is a very complicated, complex world of what it meant to be Black in the United States. And New Orleans had this large group of free people of color because it became illegal to import slaves in the early 19th century, but it didn't mean that slavery couldn't continue here. And with Dédé's career, which I'm learning, is that opportunities became even more complicated. Anybody who's a historian of American history knows that what it meant to be Black in the United States means something different in the 17th century, 18th century, and up through the 19th century when enslavement was a big thing. But he really had his finger on the pulse as he could see that things with the Fugitive Slave Act and then Dred Scott in the 50s, that it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain a status of being free and able to move around. And so, if I'm getting my dates correctly, he left for Mexico in the late 1840s and then went to Paris, was an auditor at the Conservatoire, and then in Bordeaux in around 1855, 56, and then stayed there for a while and was able not to, and I'm getting most of my history from this wonderful biography by Sally McKee, who I know has been involved with this production. But it's not as though being Black in France allowed you to do everything you earned or you should be able to do, but it gave you a whole lot more opportunities than here in the US. And Dédé's career, what we're learning about it, it's once you get that larger view, and I think those of you from New Orleans who know this history of how people of color, whether Black or, and I know there are many differentiations of Creole, it's just not everybody is a slave, and it changes over time. So this is a wonderful thing that this project and this opera and recovering him from the shadows and hidden history gets to do for our knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the most surprising things that I found as we've been working on this is that Dédé is not an outlier in his own community, but rather he's part of a community of musicians in New Orleans who we now sort of post facto refer to as the Creole Romantics, who have deep connections to New Orleans. So Givonna, I think you teach on this subject. What is the significance of opera in New Orleans during the first half of the 19th century, and how were free people of color involved in that art form? Because New Orleans is a very unique place, both musically and socially, in that people could attend these productions together, I think.
Wow. Yeah, it's very interesting. You think during the highlight of slavery that some of these things would not be happening, but indeed, we were sometimes more together then than we were together after the Civil War, when Jim Crow laws came into being. When New Orleans did their production of Grétry Sylvain in 1796, and this expansion happened with the opera houses, they started building the opera houses for how people would sit together or how people would be seated. They made sure that they had balcony sections for the enslaved. They had a middle section for the free people. They had the orchestra for the enslavers. And hilariously, they also had a special section for expecting women who were not really supposed to be seen in public. So they could see the opera through a certain screen, but nobody could see them.
I love this. Pregnant women need to see opera too. So we will let you have a special place for you. That's perfect. New Orleans, you got it right.
But as I was saying earlier, in the mid-1700s, this was not a hospitable place to be. We hadn't learned how to pump the water out. We didn't have good sanitation. It was people, even I heard that prisoners from France and Spain were saying, please don't send me there because it's not a place to be. So the powers that be said we should bring in the balls, we should bring in the operas from Europe. And the story is that women would leave home in their regular clothes and get to the ball or the opera house, and there was a place to wash their legs and feet from all the that they were walking through to get there, and they put on their fancy clothes and they would attend. Now, what is remarkable is that because we were a Catholic colony, whatever, the the King of France said, you cannot make enslaved people work on a Sunday. They must go to church. So we went to church, and after church, those who had particular skills in terms of masonry or ironwork or carpentry and those things like that, they would often hire themselves out. And there was an agreement with their owner that they would make money. They would use that money to buy their freedom, but some of them also used the money to buy tickets to the opera. So it's always been a part of our experience here in New Orleans, always been.
Givonna, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
When we were preparing Sylvain ourselves, I was doing a lot of reading on New Orleans opera, and reading that Henry Kamen book about the origins of the KMEN. He wrote a dissertation for Tulane, I guess, and I was struck by how so much of it came out of the dance. That New Orleans was, of course, dance crazy, and that there were all these different balls, some for white people, some for Black people, and some for people of free people of color, and that there were so many orchestras in New Orleans because there were all these dance musicians, and that of course many of them were Black and free people of color both, and that was so once opera started, it was coming out of this culture that was already going, that was wonderfully dance crazy.
Yeah, and we still are. We still are dance crazy. When you think about New Orleans from 1796 to about 1920, we had 6 opera houses. So this was not a small thing. It was not a one place to go. It was our real lived experience of opera and classical music, and definitely the balls. And I'll tell you that the white people started sneaking into the balls that the free people of color were having because the food was so good.
This is
probably the music too.
I love this discussion about New Orleans and many opera houses. I haven't followed up on this, but I've heard, and Givonna, you just mentioned from 1796 to 1920, there were 6 houses. I'd heard there were 4 in the 19th century, and I'm sure that, but not many cities had an opera house in the 19th century, and to have more than one, it's pretty incredible. I also, because the official opera history, I've heard the opera history that hasn't included a lot of the incredible Black participation that we're beginning to see, is that it was Manuel Garcia in 1826. He was Rossini's first barber for Barber of Seville. And there was a troupe that came over in 1826 in New York. And that's great and that's wonderful, but it can sort of seem like this was Italian opera coming to the United States. Now, there's a lot of great research that shows English language opera. Kitty Preston has done that, but the New Orleans story needs to be told, and this is a beautiful way to really put it on the map. I just want to put in one little quick thing. I love it when you said, Givonna, that some of the European prisoners was like, please don't send me to the US. Isn't that in Puccini's Manon Lescaut? Isn't it that they end up in a prison in Louisiana? I remember thinking, oh, what's that all about?
Yes, indeed, it is.
Yeah, I think it's amazing to think of all of the operas that were premiered in New Orleans in the first half of the 19th century. So many Rossini operas usually premiered in French rather than in Italian, even if they were primarily started out as Italian. But so The Italian Girl in Algiers, William Tell, these were all premiered in New Orleans after you got their American premiere. Many pieces by Meyerbeer, Adolphe Adam were premiered in New Orleans, and in front of, as Givonna said, in front of a community that was white, free people of color, and enslaved people, who were separated, but who all experienced this music at the same time, which is very different than the rest of the United States at this point. There were places where Black people went to see opera and places where white people went to see opera, but there was no place in the first half of the 19th century, except for New Orleans, where Black people and white people went to the same place. And so it's a different story than I grew up with personally in music school, and I think it's really important that we begin to uncover that. It's how much of a melting pot the opera theater was, and a gathering point in 19th century New Orleans. So this month and next, we're going to be Givonna, to you.
I just wanted to add, but to give you an example of the free people of color's involvement in the music, in opera, and probably playing in those orchestras when the American premieres were happening. By 1840, they established their own orchestra of 100 free men of color and some whites. Wow. So here we are in 1840 with an integrated orchestra, built their own building in which to perform in. And so that just gives a great example of, you just can't find 100 classically trained orchestral, with orchestral and opera skills just out of the ether. So that was part of our real community.
I think also what you had said about Dédé's family coming from Saint-Domingue, so much, in our research about French opera, which was pervasive in not only New Orleans, but Charleston in the 1890s and a little bit later. That was, so much of that was because of the Haitian Revolution and the exodus of musicians from Saint-Domingue to New Orleans and Charleston. And then when you read the personnel lists of the touring musicians in the 1790s and the next 20 years up and down the east coast of America, it's the same troupe, and most of them are people who were from the orchestras in Saint-Domingue. And so it's this, really, before that Italian stuff comes in, it's French opera in America, and mostly because of that connection. And also through Cuba too. Yeah.
Go ahead.
One of my favorite stories is Minette Ferrand, who was a free woman of color in Saint-Domingue, who was the first soloist for French opera, and was engaged in the Haitian Revolution and moved to New Orleans. Yeah. So she came with the wave as well, trying to find out what she performed. I know she performed Gretry in Saint-Domingue, but
we did a whole set of online series on her 2 years ago or three, when we did that concert that then came to New Orleans, and which is when Jonathan Woody met you, and after he had performed with us, and how we made the introduction to you, which was so great.
Right. Yeah.
One thing, because I know we've got such a strong New Orleans group here in our Zoom room, but also I think in our larger Zoom who's in our group here. But for somebody who isn't from New Orleans, I have been learning about Dédé, learning that New Orleans, just in terms of geography and how things were happening in the 19th, in the late 18th and particularly the 19th century, how New Orleans can be seen as part of the Northern Caribbean basin. And so to think that Dédé's family came from Saint-Domingue, it's not like, oh, Haiti is just sort of out there and landed in New Orleans, but it was part of this type of culture and regular interactions and migrations that were happening. And it really, with France's connection with Saint-Domingue, and then also with Louisiana, and it begins to bring into bolder relief how Dédé isn't such an outlier. I mean, he's amazing, and he's a brand new story for the mainstream knowledge now. And luckily, we are changing this. That we're changing it. But the fact that France and New Orleans and Saint-Domingue, the Haitian Revolution, the American Revolution, all of this is feeding the French Revolution. I mean, we've got three revolutions in the 1780s, early 90s that, with France, the US, Haiti, and France. And it's all sort of, this is a type of crucible of what's happening.
And I'll add just a teeny little bit about the French Revolution. There was a very significant free man of color in New Orleans, who was present in France for their second French Revolution. He got his medical degree there, and he came back and started a whole push for freedom in New Orleans that today it became historically a part of. But so that connection between France and New Orleans in terms of the fight for freedom also became very significant and showed up in the music.
We've had sort of the background of where Dédé came from, but this month and next we're going to be giving the world premiere of Morgiane, which is a 4-act French grand opera composed in 1887, and it's sort of the capstone of Dédé's quite large compositional output, but it was never performed during his lifetime. I mean, he primarily worked after the Grand Théâtre. He worked in music, in operetta and ballet, and in popular music. And I think that it's significant that we mentioned to our audience that this is not a modern premiere that we are giving. This is a world premiere. And I guess I need to ask you the question, Givonna, is how is it possible that this piece of music, which is scored for giant romantic orchestra by an American, did he come back to the United States? Would New Orleans have been a place that he would have wanted this to be premiered? How is it possible that this is a world premiere 138 years later?
It's a heartbreaking idea. In one of his symphonies did premiere here in New Orleans, and days after the Civil War was over, but he was not here for it, the Quasimodo Symphony. He came back home one time around 1897 and was surprised to find out he was not allowed to perform in some of our best acoustical places, our opera houses, our theaters. And he did concerts in churches and homes. So he found it to be even more oppressive than when he left. And he determined he was never coming back again. And he wrote the Exoticism piece, of which I would love to find, saying goodbye to his city. And it's unfortunate. I don't know if he tried to have Morgiane premiered here while he was here, but he wasn't received well by wider New Orleans.
I just want to pause on that as an African-American woman, a Black woman here, and how the narratives I've heard of the past, and how to hear of a free man of color in the, born in 1827 and having a life left when it became too frightening for what that freedom would mean in the 50s, comes back in the 90s. So after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, and just the heartbreaking element. It's not at all the narrative you think, oh, Civil War, yay, yay, we're done and we're moving forward. But for him to feel this is much worse than what it was is, it's sobering, but it's an important part of how history has been shaped here in the U.S. for Black
even
folks.
Though he didn't live here, when the Civil War broke out, 1,000 free men of color came together and signed a petition demanding the right to vote from President Abraham Lincoln. And Edmond Dédé lent his signature on that document.
Wow.
And so his focus of making sure that everybody can be fully human, fully citizen, fully an artist, was always with him. Beautiful thing.
Yeah. And it's also, I think, interesting to note, and a how complex this situation is of this piece of music, because it is a piece of music that is written by an American who is expatriated himself to France. He's living in Bordeaux, and then he writes a, 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 an opera based on a story that is set in historical Persia. And this is what I think, starting from the late 70s forward, 1970s forward, we begin to refer to as an Orientalist setting. And so, Naomi, this question is for you, which is, when does Europe's obsession with the Middle East, Asia, and North Africa begin, and how does it manifest itself particularly in opera?
It's a great question, and a lot of people have written about it. And I'm going to focus on opera, but just to give a little bit, sort of a couple of points to ground that. One question I want to start with, or a way for beginning to think about exoticism and difference, is who is telling the story and what is the positionality of who is writing about something, who's on the inside, who's on the outside. So when we are talking about European and American today stories and history, it's usually from the role of the people who've been the colonizers, or whether it's settler colonialism here in the United States around Native American communities. It's this idea of who is writing and telling the story. So I want to say that exoticism can work in any way. The discourse has been framed, or at least in modern times, from 1978, where Edward Said has a book called Orientalism. And he didn't invent the term, but he coined it to talk about power relationships between the West and then the West, the Occident, or the East, and the Orient. Now, who is the West and who is the East is much more of a ideological construction than actual geographic locations. And so you can have the West being people in Europe, the people who are doing a lot of the colonizing, who we have that history of knowing about it, and in terms of these formations that Said is talking about, it goes back. He focuses a lot on the Napoleonic campaigns in 1798. And so for the 19th century. However, we know these things can go back earlier. Without going into all the details of this, France is a place where we can really think about Orientalism and opera, because one, they were a settled government and a kingdom and an empire that went out, whereas the German Confederation weren't doing that. England was doing it, but they didn't have a strong opera tradition. France had both opera and the colonial power. And so we see things from Lully and Rameau, opera ballets, Les Ingalantes, which I think is something that Opera Lafayette has done, where you've got sort of what is considered the norm. We talk about this as sort of a hegemonic norm, looking at somebody who is different. And there's an excitement and curiosity. And then there's also a little bit of a fear as a threat. And so this need for domination. So this becomes a big thing we see this in sort of Western European classical music in the late 18th century with Mozart and sort of these Turkish styles. The abduction from the seraglio is one. We also have sort of going through, Rossini is doing this, we've mentioned, with Il Turco in Italia, Italiana in Algiers. But we really get this in the middle and late 19th century. Just to place Dédé with his opera from 1887, the 1870s were a huge time. You've got Verdi's Aida and from 71, and then Otello from 87, which are really looking at sort of these others. You've got Meyerbeer with L'Africain, which is in the mid-60s, Sasson's Samson and Dalila from 1877, Bizet's Carmen is 1875. And in all of these cases, Oh, you've got people who are the vantage point of the storyteller is somebody who is looking at an exoticized other. And so usually there's a person like Don Jose in Carmen, who I think of him as almost the tour guide character. He's from, like helping us, the audience, written for French bourgeoisie audience by Bizet, and having France, Navarre, where Don Jose is from, is sort of in northern France in the Basque area, sort of near Spain. So he's the one who then goes down to Andalusia, where Seville, and he sees Carmen. And so frequently, Vasco da Gama is in Meyerbeer's L'Africaine. You've got somebody who's sort of one of us who then looks at the other. Even when you have things like Aida and you've got the Egyptians and the Ethiopians are being colonized by the Egyptians, and both of them at different points are sort of turned into these primitive or othered, exoticized places. The wonderful thing to think about with Dede being a Black man who is in Paris for so long, early on in his career in New Orleans, he got to see Alivé's La Juive, he saw Meyerbeer. Sort of what is his positionality as he's telling these stories? And I haven't seen this opera yet because only you two and a few others have seen it. I can't wait to see it in the beginning of February when it happens. But these will be really interesting things to look at with how is the exoticism parsed. He's very much coming out of the 19th century French time when this is a big thing. But what does it mean? It's a work that wasn't performed, really should have been, we wish it had been, and now it's being performed in 2025. There's just so many interesting things of who's representing whom and what is exoticized and what is sort of who has power, there's just the themes, the central tenets around exoticism and representation and orientalism, using the big scare quotes, because I'm referring to Said's use of power, are all really operative and exciting ways here. Thoughtful.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, I think, Naomi, to answer your question about this particular piece, it really is all about the other and power, and the other and is also the person who initially in this opera has the power, which is the Sultan of Ispahan, which is the other title for Morgiane. And so the Sultan, who doesn't even appear until Act 3, controls all of the action from afar, starting in Act 1 and 2, kidnaps someone. The family of the kidnapped person comes to Ispahan to liberate him from the all-powerful Sultan. And when we were introduced to the Sultan in the third act, his music is completely different than everyone else. There's no strings accompanying him. He's only accompanied by wind music. Additionally, which is strangely, Dédé was taught by his father, who was a wind band leader, and so
he has that in his
and also from a musical standpoint, Dédé uses pretty regular phrase structure. So sort of what we would think of as 4-bar and 8-bar and 12-bar phrase structures, which are sort of like normal song form. But when the Sultan comes in, he talks in 3-bar phrases. He sings in 5-bar phrases. He's accompanied completely different. So we get this idea of the other almost in our ears before we even realize that, oh, this is the person who is on the outside. Because by the end, he's shown to be like, he's a drunk, he's sort of overbearing, he's really terrible to the wife he has had and to the wife that he's trying to get. He's about to commit a crime against nature at the end, before he's stopped by the title character Morgiane. And so the other is very, very, very present in this piece of music. Now, Naomi, I want in Black opera, which I I encourage everyone to like go to Amazon and buy. It's a great, great, great explanation of the idea of Orientalism, but particularly how Orientalism and Blackness go hand in hand in opera. So could you talk to us about that? Because when we think of Orientalism, we think of portrayals of the East, portrayals, and I think it has something to do with the other, but can you make that connection for us?
Absolutely. And thank you. For your kind words about this book. I've been thinking of Black opera. That actually wasn't the title I wanted to give it, but I really loved my editor, still do, at Illinois, Lori Matheson. And I think I had something experiencing, it was some long academic title with a colon. And she said, well, marketing wants to call it Black Opera History, Power, Engagement. And I think of it, and this does relate to the Orientalism, exoticism element, that Black opera is a construction. Rather than saying there's white opera, Black opera, though nation is important in how different elements come out in opera, it's this idea of power and representation, and then also who do we see on stage, who is performing who is in the pit, who are making the decisions about what to program. It's this idea to have, and Givonna, you used a phrase earlier that I just adore and think about it a lot on my own. How are Black people being made human on the opera stage and not just a two-dimensional, or in the US, we have this awful minstrel stereotypes. So when I was talking about positionality and who has power is one of the central tenets of how we think of exoticism, Orientalism, the other in opera. Blackness, Black people, Black topics, Black librettists, Black singers, this is all sort of wrapped in there in terms of how is power parsed and who comes out as being portrayed as more, and I don't want to use the word authentic because that sort of raises lots of issues, but what is an accurate, true portrayal of human nature, which is really what opera is all about, to go there and to feel something. And no matter, none of us are currently living in this made up time of the pharaohs of Verdi's Aida. Yet I'd like to say that in a performance in Act 3, you feel the alienation and the pain of Aida. You feel Amneris's rage in the fourth act. And none of this is real. Opera, verisimilitude, verismo, all of these things. It's trying, I think Orientalism is one side of the spectrum, and then sort of a realness in terms of getting human emotions. Not like, we know it's on stage, we know people don't sing to each other every day. I mean, unless you're really, really special. Most people have a lot, but a good opera performance, once you get used to it and understand the conventions, it touches us all to the core. It's not an elitist form. These conversations we've been having about New Orleans shows that early opera in the United States is not necessarily only about power and elitism and exclusion, but that you can have people in the opera house. And I love this, with a special place to make sure pregnant women who need opera too get to be there. New Orleans does it all.
Yes, indeed. As you're talking, one of the things that comes to my mind in looking at this exoticism and this trend that was happening in opera, that Dédé was in Bordeaux, and another son of New Orleans. His father was a free composer of color, born here, but he was born in France. He's in Paris, and they're both writing interesting operas in different places, but they handle the otherism in a different way. The person that becomes the other is the person who thinks that they have power in a way. And so it's kind of interesting. So we have Lucien Lambert in Paris writing an opera set in Senegal. We have him writing an opera set in Cuba.
Wow.
and it's very interesting in the stories that he tells. And the opera set in Cuba, we performed at La Flamenca, and I kept saying, why did he write this opera set in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, and what's that about? And the protagonist, the woman, La Flamenca, they called her Flamenca, she was fighting against subjugation against the Spanish. And then I said, why are we doing this story? It turns out that white soldiers from the North were going down to try to help Cuba, and they kept dying because they couldn't handle the climate and the whatever. And they found a battalion of Black soldiers in New Orleans who had survived yellow fever, who they called the Dragoons, and they sent them to New Orleans to fight to help Cuba against Spain.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so here are these two opera composers, both in France. I don't know that they ever met, but they were doing this exoticism, but kind of turning it on its head a little bit, which is very interesting.
This is what one thing I talk a lot about in Black opera is a shadow culture. And I say shadow not because it's lesser than, but it's happening simultaneously as the mainstream culture, usually the all-white culture that we know about, that we've had history. Dédé is operating, this other composer, Lucien, you said, is operating at the same time in different spaces probably. And with Dédé and his opera, it wasn't even in a space per se, except in his head and what he's imagining. But this is happening simultaneously, showing us different views of how power or how entertainment, how art and aesthetics are expressed. We've had a fabulous view from the history that's known. So it's not, I don't want to say, oh, the shadow culture is something that is, we should be mad about. I mean, yeah, in the past, but now we get to bring it to light. It's only going to enrich what we get to know and what we think about. We get more stories. It's sort of an additive positive thing, and it doesn't diminish what we already have.
I think this is a good time. So we just talked about Lucien Lambert, who is part of a much larger family of people who have New Orleans connections, who are writing what we would think of as Western art music, classical music in America. But, these are probably new names for many of us. I mean, including like me and Naomi on this
I'm
call.
writing them down.
And so, like, the mission of OperaCréole, Givonna, has been to acknowledge and produce music by 19th century free people of color. And I would really like to know what have been the biggest challenges in doing so, and then what has been the reaction of audiences once they encounter the music?
The first challenge, I would say, is people think I made it up. Can't be true. Where did she get that from? And sometimes getting people to visualize or how to put money to something that they've never heard. They see something on paper. They're not musicians. They don't really know. But some of the best moments in my life have been to see these big men come to the performance only because they knew somebody or they knew it was a historical thing, but they had said, I'm not gonna like it, I'm just gonna go. And then they come to me crying, bawling in the end.
Wow.
And so thankful for not only the history, but how beautiful and how the music touched them. That's the best part.
Yeah. I mean, I think that has been a really eye-opening thing for me, is that when certainly it happens with composers who are outside of the received canon of music, but particularly when it's composers of color, that the first question when you tell people is, well, is it good music? And you're like, yeah. What you don't understand is that, like, Dédé was the only person who looked like him at the conservatoire, was the only person who looked like him in the pit in Bordeaux. He was the only Black music director in Bordeaux when he was appointed. And if there's anything about French music at the time and now, but certainly at the time, that it was a strict meritocracy, that like it was one of the most crowded musical environments of all time. And that Dédé was able to perform many of his pieces, probably over 100 works, meant that not only was it great music, but he was dogged in actually getting it performed. I mean, imagine the level of commitment to the art form that he must have had, and how good his music was, in order to also get beyond people looking at him and thinking of him as sort of this person who doesn't look like anyone, who probably speaks, French with a New Orleans accent, who's writing music that's different than everyone around him. How extraordinary must he have been, not just as a musician, but also as an advocate for his own music, that he was able to do so. And so it's people should be asking the other question, which is, how is it possible that this has been obscured for so long? It's the opposite question, because that we even have it today is a miracle, and shows like that how exceptional he must have been. I don't mean to like turn this, but let's talk about like a slightly different. You've already talked about, Givonna, how opera and the larger struggle for civil rights for Black Americans are intrinsically linked, particularly through the actions of 19th century free people of color in New Orleans. I think Eldrick let us know that both his relatives, his ancestors, and your ancestors also signed that petition of 1,000 free people of color. But this is not where this story ends. Can you talk about some of the other actions that the free people of color took as part of music and opera that have kept us that I didn't know about till you told me the story about Eugene McCarthy. Would you talk to us about that?
Well, we got to the point of, the war is over. We were finally given the right to vote. We built a college, a medical school. We had integrated buses. Some of the schools were integrated. Everything was going in the way that you would imagine. And then the shutdown of Jim Crow came. It's like, oh no, this is too much. We're not doing this. We've got to get these people back under control. And so the laws changed. And around 1875, you really start to see things break down. In my own family, one of my ancestors that owned property in the French Quarter, you see that they're being forced to sell it. They have to get out of the French Quarter, even if they own property. But this moment at the French Opera House is when Victor Eugene McCarthy goes. We're supposed to be at a point of integration, and he buys a ticket in what was the white section of the French Opera House. They sold him the ticket, and he didn't really look like a Black man, but people knew him as a musician. Once they saw him sitting there, they got the manager. The manager ejected him. He went and he filed what we think may be one, if not the first lawsuit for the integration of a performing arts space. I forget, Calabrese, I think was the last name of the suit against. And the free people or formerly, free people of color of New Orleans, the opera goers, said that they would protest with their dollars. They refused to buy any more tickets to the French Opera House. And at the end of the season, French Opera House did not have the money to send their singers back to France. We made a major economic impact in 1875. But now, being who we are, Victor Eugene McCarthy got together with another composer, Basile Barré, and they put on a benefit performance for those singers and raised the money and gave them the money so they could go home.
Wow.
So, unbelievable. So I, I, I want to ask, we're going to get, and so, but for members of our audience, if you have some questions, we probably will have a little bit of time that I can ask them to Naomi and Givonna. But I think that there's two. I think that I would like to ask both of you, Naomi and Givonna, why is the restoration of Edmond Dédé to the canon of America's composers important for American musical history? I'm going to start with Naomi, and then maybe we can move to Givonna. So
I'm so glad you're asking that because it hooks into something that I've been wanting to mention. The importance of it, as one of the big things I believe, is that it's a space, the opera theater, the art as a space can be a place where people can live together and see the humanity in each other. And this was one of the points I was trying to make before. And that's kind of the big overarching reason that I think this is very healing and important for this moment where we are in history. There are two other great things, though, I want to bring up that Dédé's history helps us understand, which relates to a part of the conversation just from a few moments ago. As we learn about Dédé's history and how he was trained in a wide range of art forms, he wasn't just a composer of opera and ballet, but we know he wrote ballets. We know this is one opera, there might be others, but he also worked in different types of concert houses or music hall type places, the sort of different. I don't like the designation of high and low, but thinking of in terms of what is considered concert music and then more popular vernacular popular music. He's writing in all these genres, and it's something that isn't just unique to him. We see this a lot in Black composers. We see this in a lot of jazz composers. Well, it's very people want to think, oh, there's just this genius that they can't read music, and maybe for some folks they can sing by ear or play by ear, but for most people what is happening in schools and the education, in the training, is that they're getting the Western canon, sort of the Bach or the Mozart or something like that. And then sadly being banned from a lot of those areas, that knowledge isn't just wasted, it's infusing other stuff. So Dédé with we've got this opera and it's wonderful. And I hope that we'll get, it sounds like some of his music is still being performed. Givonna, you mentioned singing Mon Pauvre Coeur is one of your first pieces, but it would be great having these works come to life, show us that it's possible to mix all these things together. And it seems that anybody can do this, but we get this a lot with Black composers because of the spaces that are closed off. So that's one thing that's really exciting. And another thing, Patrick, when you were talking about him at the conservatoire and in these spaces that seem to be all white, I don't at all disagree with you, but there is the thought, maybe there are others we don't know about. And he begins to open this door. We know that there were certain schools, the New England Conservatory, Oberlin, even the Juilliard School a little later on. But these are places that before a lot of other places, there would be sort of a quota of just a couple. Florence Price was at the New England Conservatory. William Grant Still was there. Where are these others? Rather than thinking, oh, Dédé, and we've lost so many folks, it's more like, who do we have yet to discover? Who else was there and who saw him or heard about him and then thought, I'm going to do that. I'm going to try. Who was in his studio that we don't know about? There's from the two pictures we have and some things that have come up in documentation, he stood out. And so people notice this, and that's a model in a lot of good ways. So I see this as beginning a new space of opportunity and possibilities. That's one of the really important things this is doing.
And I will add, I have a little thing in my class at Loyola that I always try to come back to, because we talk about the injustices and the struggles and one of the things that we have to say about Dédé's life, and in some of our other free composers of color, and one of the first to really give him serious lessons was an Italian immigrant. And there are many opportunities that he was able to successfully get through because we do great things together. When we come together, when we open the door together, we do great things together. And I want this to be an example of that. This opera not being performed was one of the tragedies, but the fact that he did have success meant that he found people he could be simpatico with, and that he was able to make his way. One of the first things that OperaCréole did, and it was just ironic that I was talking with a historian with the Afro-classical blog. His name won't come to me, but he says, do you know they just found an opera in Croydon, England that was sitting there for 100 years, sitting in a drawer? And I said, what? And it just so happened that the person that found it decided to publish it. And so that was one of the first things we did was Samuel Coleridge Taylor's Thelma, that was sitting in the drawer from the time of his death in 1912 until someone found it in 2012. Wonderful, like Wagnerian, just absolutely wonderful music. And so there are all these composers that I think will open the door to conversation and for us to understand that we have more in common, that we like things similar, that we have similar stories. And I think it's just a powerful thing. It's a powerful thing.
I think that we have a few questions, but one of them is a very practical one, which is, do we have a synopsis of Morgiane? And we do, and I'll make sure that is sent out to everyone who is on this program this evening. So just want to make sure that everyone knows that we will do it. The easy version, like the 3-sentence version of the synopsis of this show is: young woman on her wedding day is kidnapped by the soldiers of an evil sultan. Her family travels across the continent to get to Persia and goes into disguise to rescue her. And in the end, after they are thrown into jail and the sultan is about to kill them all, her mother says, "You can't do it." And the sultan says, "Why?" And she says, "Well, first, I don't know if you recognize this ring, but this is the ring you gave to me the day that our daughter was born. And I got the hell out of there. I ran across and through things, and I was rescued by this man here. And you can't marry my daughter because she's also your daughter." So it's a great sort of operatic plot, only in opera, sort of a Maury Povician, "you are the father" moment. So it has a story that even shocks today. So it's a great twist at the end, and really worth seeing how Dédé sets this. It's important to note that Dédé did not write the libretto, and it was written by someone named Louis Brunet, who we don't actually know who Louis Brunet was, because there were a number of people with that name in Bordeaux at that time. And so it's a bit mysterious in terms of who Louis Brunet was. And all of the information that we have about Dédé is the vast majority is secondhand. It's what was written about him in newspapers, what was written about him from other people. The thing that he leaves behind is music. He doesn't really leave behind much about himself, or and I think that this is, so we, even now, the only way that we can get to Dédé is through his music. And so how I think that's important to note. Givonna and Naomi, is there anything that you want to leave us with? We're getting sort of to the end of our time. I don't know. I don't think that we have any other questions. But is there something that we haven't gotten to today that you want to make sure that everyone knows?
Well, I'll jump in first just because I know I want Givonna to have the last word. So I have learned so much in getting to know about Dédé, and there's a little bit that's out there. There's a great biography and by Sally McKee, and there's also the materials that your productions, the OperaCréole, Opera Lafayette productions. From what I understand, there's a program book that'll be out there. There's this series of talks. And so there's just a lot of materials are coming out there, and people who are interested, it's not like, oh, we see it. It's so hard with new works, particularly operas, where you don't always have a CD recording, or it's not, the score isn't available. But there is, hopefully those things might be coming, but there is some other stuff. The thing I would like to leave before we have sort of the final words is if you could just spend a moment saying something about, or make sure that everybody knows where the performances are, what the talks are. I know this is probably on, but this is such an exciting thing. I know I'm going to the College Park, Maryland performance in the beginning of February, but it's in different cities. And so people can go, this is not to be missed. This is one of the most important things happening in this whole time period of 2020's opera. This is a really important thing.
Sure. So we will be having another talk at the Folger Shakespeare Library on next Thursday, which is January 16th. Givonna will be in DC for that. And we will the link to that is in the chat right now. The Folger is sort of exciting because the Folger will, for the first time ever, will display the manuscript of Edmond Dédé, and I think it's in the same room that the first folios of Shakespeare are. Don't quote me on that yet, but it is amidst this document collection that we will be displaying. The Folger Shakespeare Library will be displaying it. It will be on display from January 15th to the end of February. So people have, if they can't come that even, I really encourage you to go to the Folger Shakespeare Library to see that. We have 4 performances. We will be in New Orleans on January 23rd to give a sort of 90-minute performance of this work. We have some constraints because we're performing it in the cathedral, St. Louis Cathedral, which is where Dédé was baptized, and it is it's an old building that's been added on to many times. So we don't actually have enough bathrooms for the people who will be in there. So we have to keep it pretty short so that there's no intermission. We will also be performing most of the opera. So without the ballets, we'll be for most of the opera in Washington, D.C. on February 3rd at the Lincoln Theater on U Street. We will then on February 4th have a presentation with Opera Ebony and Opera America in New York on that evening. I think Sally McKee may actually be there. Givonna will be speaking. And then we have a performance at Jazz at Lincoln Center on February 5th. We will come back and perform on February 7th at the University of Maryland. And on February 8th, we will record this for commercial release, which will, probably happen a year from then. So, and I think there are at least 2 live streams of this as well. New Orleans will be live streamed, as will the University of Maryland. So even if you can't, if you're watching this from San Francisco and you can't make it, I mean, it's worth it being in person. But if you can't, you can catch one of those. And maybe I could turn it over to Givonna to tell us, what's if you have one takeaway, if people have one takeaway from this, what is the takeaway?
Oh my goodness. Well, the takeaway for me is that I'm always inspired. I think that if there's a thought that comes in your mind that's constantly on your mind at night and in the morning, it's bound to be part of your mission. You should listen to it. I am so happy I have listened to myself and continue to work on behalf of Edmond Dédé. And I'm also happy that I have had singers come into OperaCréole. Eldrick was one of the original ones that I consider to be what can I say? Curators. This is when you're picking up music nobody's seen. You can't go to YouTube and figure out how this person is singing it, and you've got to look at these notes and bring this to life and make it make sense. It's a special skill and a special level of dedication. And some of my singers are covering the lead roles, singing comprimario small roles, and singing chorus. And 2 of them are helping me with all of the business end of running the company. They are amazing. And I'm so grateful that I've kept going and kept, and I've been lucky enough to have people come into this endeavor who are also understanding the mission of it all. And so that's what I will say to people, keep going. The funniest story for me is in New Orleans' 300th birthday, I decided, let's write an opera about these free people of color and this petition to Abraham Lincoln. And my daughter says, okay, my mom's lost her mind. She's, And so what I did was arranged most of the music of the Lamberts and Basile Barré and Dédé and Snayer. All of those men came out of New Orleans. I put some of my own stuff, and I put historical text on top to tell the story about this petition to Abraham Lincoln. And it was through that, Eldrick, that I found out that my great-great-grandfather had signed the petition.
Wow.
That I learned so much about New Orleans history that has affected my own life. So sometimes your mission will bring you back to even knowing yourself better. Mm-hmm. So just keep going.
If you want more information about our performances on January 23rd and February 3rd, 5th, and 7th, you can find it at operalafayette.org or operacreole.org. We have an unbelievably special thank you to our guest scholar, Naomi André, for joining us this evening. You can find her books on Amazon.com. Just search her name. I own 2 of them and have another one on the way. They're easy, informative, and page-turning reads. And I really encourage you to pick up a copy. Also, I need to thank my dear friend, colleague, and partner, Givonna Joseph, who is founder and artistic director of New Orleans OperaCréole, and perhaps one of the most inspiring musicians that I know. You can find out more about her work in New Orleans by going to OperaCréole.org, and you can subscribe to their newsletter. They had great one that came out just recently, and we at Opera Lafayette are very privileged to be able to partner with OperaCréole. This is exciting for us, but this is like the daily work that Givonna has done for every day of her organization's existence, and so we really have to, I have to personally, and we as an organization have to really give credit to Givonna Joseph for being the leader that we can follow in this whole endeavor. So thank you all for being here this evening. We appreciate, if you like this, we are going to be, I think we are live streaming the talk next week, which is on a different set of topics, and about the history of the manuscript of Dédé's Morgiane. We hope that you'll see it, and also at our show. So thank you so much for being here, and look forward to seeing you at the premiere. Bravi tutti. So,
For a blessing, Patrick. Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.